Facebook and Instagram are temporarily allowing posts calling for violence against Russian soldiers, but it won't apply here in the U.S., so don't go trying this at home. The amended rule only applies if you're in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, or several other Eastern European countries, according to Reuters. A media spokeswoman said, quote, "As a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have temporarily made allowances for forms of political expression that would normally violate our rules, like violent speech, such as death to the Russian invaders. We still won't allow credible calls for violence against Russian civilians."
Posts that call for the death of Putin and Belarusian President Lukashenko were also given the green light. The Intercept reported that Meta will also allow praise of the right-wing Azov battalion, which was previously and normally prohibited.
Isn't this interesting?
Yes, you could call to it, but only if you're in these other countries. I wonder why it is that only if you're in these certain countries. Is it because sometimes in certain languages, like I know in Arabic, for example, death to something is...
It just means it sucks.
Right. It's
yeah.
a typical phrase. So they say death to traffic, death to...
Yes.
That's all it means. It doesn't actually mean
if
like...
it's a credible threat against a specific traffic, then
that could be right. Then it's a
No, I think I don't think that's what they are intending. I think their thinking is that it is morally justified to call for death to Russians, death to Russian soldiers if you live in those areas. Obviously, they had a committee meeting to decide this. So it's kind of look. I think it might be perfectly defensible. Actually, maybe it suggests that in general the policies around what you're allowed to say on Facebook and other social media platforms should be a little bit more permissible than they are now. If all of a sudden there's something like this and they go, oh wait, maybe it would be okay for people to say these things.
Right. So you're allowed to call for the assassination of a foreign leader or even the killing of troops.
Right.
So as long as you're in one of these countries.
Right.
And it seems like it's the self-defense argument taken to the geopolitical scale.
Right.
This isn't really self-defense, is it?
Well,
So
Russia...
if you're in Poland, so what is it, Poland?
Well, I mean,
if you're in Ukraine...
Russia's saber-rattling at Poland.
They're the invaders.
But if you're in any other or Eastern European country, which I would like to know that list. So is this like the Baltic nation?
Before you call for the death of anybody?
Yeah. It's like, did we make the list? Can we do this? Or can
get a VPN that puts you in Poland?
Then
so
you could do it, potentially, yeah. I mean, this just, personally, I don't think any call for violence should be allowed at all. I mean, self-defense is one thing, but this isn't really self-defense to say, I'm calling for the assassination of a president. That's like saying, that is...
That's why every military, every government after World War II renamed their War Department Defense Department or Defense Ministry. They were all war ministries, then they became defense ministries, and all of a sudden they became imperial. Funny how that works. We had Jason Miller on, remember, to talk about founding Getter.
Yeah.
And we asked him, well, what are you going to allow? What are you not going to allow? He said, well, we're not going to allow calls for violence. We're like, well, what about the American Revolution? And he was like,
But that's different. I don't think you can call for violence directly. So you could say, maybe you could say...
So you can't support the American Revolution?
Well, no, but I think
you can't call for...
You could say you support the overturn... You can support a peaceful overturn of the government or a change in the government.
How do you have a peaceful American Revolution?
We do it every 4 years, right? I mean, every 4 years we vote in a new government.
No, but I mean the actual American Revolution.
Right, that was not a peaceful...
Say, I don't like the Constitution, I want to throw the Constitution out. That's a form of revolution, right? But you can't say, I want to violently go and invade and take over with guns.
Until you can. And until a revolution becomes justified or a defense of sovereign territory becomes justified, like going on in Ukraine now. That's the problem with them saying that you can't promote violence, especially when the United States of America is one of the most violent, insanely violent. Like, we bomb people all the time.
Right.
So it would be like saying you cannot support the policies of your own government. Well, of course you can. You can support drone strikes.
Well, that's really what this is about, is who gets to exercise violence legitimately. I mean, that's like the state engages in violence. The police engage in violence. But we accept that state-sanctioned violence, some people accept it, not all people, that state-sanctioned violence can be justified, can be morally permissible the way just regular people committing violence isn't. That's what the state has a monopoly on, the legitimate use of violence.
They're calling this state-sanctioned violence, maybe.
But I'm curious if you could call for us to go to war with can we then say on Facebook,
Sure.
we should go to war with Russia? Because
People say that all the
would be-
time.
Yeah, but that would almost be a violation of the rules unless you're in one of these countries. Because by saying I want to go to war, we should be bombing Russia.
What we're getting at is that these rules are really bad, and there cannot be even enforcement of them because they're just far too subjective.
Really, personally, it should be if it's a crime, then I could understand them saying, okay, we don't allow crimes.
Well, the First Amendment hit something that's been litigated for 200 years. We've gotten to a place where it's extremely clearly defined and broadly agreed to, even by different ideological people. Somewhat, what is protected speech in a First Amendment sense, and then that limited category of speech that is not like direct calls for violence against specific people, in which you also give some indication of when exactly you would do it and how you would do it.
Right.
Then it crosses into illegal territory. But it has to have all of that. So just generally calling for violence kind of in the abstract, even against specific people, is not going to be illegal unless you say, and we're going to do it at 3 o'clock tomorrow and bring knives. Like that, then you're getting into illegal territory.
Right.
Call for a no-fly zone. That's calling for violence.
You're calling for the war at that point, right?
Yeah.
And you're allowed to call for a no-fly zone.
Certainly,
I think you shouldn't.
Certainly constitutional, and I don't think violates these policies, which again are
That'd be funny.
vague,
Right.
vague at best. Well, we also want to get into the latest of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Several airstrikes have hit airports in western Ukraine today. A new satellite photo also appears to show Russian forces closing in on Kyiv. The Biden administration and its allies say they see no clear end to the invasion, according to officials that spoke with the Washington Post. So
I hear
it's
that
not
they're 10
ending.
miles out of the city center at this point.
Yeah, it's
is the
not.
latest reports. So
Russia's clearly not about to give up.
no, they're not. And I think that they're probably going to end up, what we might see in the future here is we might see 2 Ukraines. So it looks like from some of the intelligence reports that are coming out that the goal of Moscow is to actually take anything east of the river. So that would include a lot of these major cities, and that would create this buffer zone between Ukraine, which would potentially at this point join NATO, maybe not, and Russia. And so there's this kind of desire to only take this portion of Ukraine, divide it up and call it East Ukraine or whatever, and we'll call it Ukraine and occupied Ukraine.
Would that end up being a failure of Putin's grand plan if the outcome of this is that whatever remains of Ukraine has no choice but to join NATO?
Why couldn't they just have a referendum on this?
Yeah.
Just vote on it.
Yeah.
Vote on what?
Like just allow Donbass to have a kind of UN sanctioned referendum. Do they want to be independent? They want to be Ukraine? They want to be Russia?
Donbass, I think they want to be independent.
Okay.
I don't think Russia has
let them vote.
Yeah, I think they have a few times, but they're not. It's not being recognized. Well, they did have the Minsk, Accords that allowed for them to have independence to some degree. But then they would send a representative into Kiev, and then that kind of fell apart because then they would say, "Well, no, you're just going to bring Russian, people who are Russian propagandists basically into our legislature. We don't want that." And so there have been all sorts of attempts to allow that region to be somewhat independent to some degree, but ultimately they've all failed.
It'd be nice to find ways to do this that aren't violent and lead to.
Everybody likes the idea of referendums until people vote the way you don't want them to vote.
Well, that area has been violent for the last 8 years.
They can also be dangerous too.
We're a violent species. Violent
Mosul, was it Kirkuk or Mosul? They were going to have a referendum. I think it was Kirkuk about whether or not they were going to be in Kurdistan, the Kurdish region, or whether they were going to be in the Sunni region. And so what they did is it led to years of each side killing each other, so there were fewer voters.
Right.
And trying to, same with in Kansas, when Stephen Douglas was like, let's have Kansas vote whether it's slave or not. So everybody went in and just went to war.
Bloody Kansas.
So you can't get away from violence necessarily just by having a vote, because then you just kill all the voters on the other side.
All right, well, we're going to wrap it up there. That's it for us today. I'll be here in the studio again on Monday, so make sure that you like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss it.
Go out and find that podcast. It's on all of the different places where you can get a podcast, and then give it a 5-star review, give it a nice rating, whether you like it or not.
Look at how cool that looks. Right?
That graphic is really cool.
It's so cool, you have to listen to that podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to listen to it.
Yeah. All right, everybody.
Have a great weekend.